Let me introduce ourselves as Yumi is our head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Rovio, which, as you might know, is the Angry Birds game studio. And you're wearing the Angry Birds uh, merchandise. Tell us a little bit about what is it like to work in one of the coolest game studios in the world?
Thank you so much for having me. How is it like to work at Rovio? So for the folks who haven't heard about Rovio, so we are the company behind the Angry Birds IP. For the folks who went through the Nokia to the smartphone days, you may remember it was very famous for that slingshot games. That's how the company started. I'm actually very new to the games industry. I only joined a little bit under 7 years ago, and before that, I was in tech. So yeah, I feel like I'm still learning.
That's fantastic. I, and it's such a fascinating company because I just think I still play the game. It's on the iPhone, it's on Apple Arcade, and it's just like I think the game's what, 15 years old, 10 years old at this point, and it's still evolving, it's still rich, it's still attracting new audiences. That's phenomenal. But I have to ask, berry picking and mushroom foraging, is that a finished thing or is that just a hobby of yours?
Where do I even start? For the folks who don't know where Finland is, it's in Northern Europe. We share one of the longest borders with Russia in Europe. And if you think about Northern Europe, what that essentially means is that there's very few people, many forests, and many things to pick from the forest. So that's where this hobby of mushroom picking and blueberry picking comes in because I actually live right next to a forest. So a typical day after work in the summer could be that I might end at work around like 4 or 5 o'clock. Then I would go to the forest next door with two big buckets and I would start collecting mushrooms and blueberries. So that is, and I think it's maybe it was very common to do that for people that are senior citizens. But then for me, I'm still new to Finland, so I just want to experience how life is like. So that is my current hobby.
That is phenomenal. I live right in downtown Manhattan. I take two buckets at the end of the day and I collect pastries and croissants, but I do not get to collect anything related to nature. But I am so jealous. Well, today this is like a really important topic that I feel like we're dealing with. It feels like we're getting completely, at least in the US, there's been DEI has been in the news for all the wrong reasons, in all the wrong ways. And it feels like we have to be as professionals in both the talent acquisition space and in the DE&I space. We have to sort of re-articulate our our mission for the world to truly appreciate. I think Europe's had it very different these last, and it continues to sort of stay on the cutting edge of trying to build fairness. So I want to talk about what is that case? How are companies evolving? How are we making the case for it? But then I also wanted to specifically spend some time on data-driven strategies that companies can use today in a very tactical way to make their hiring process both more fair, but also just more effective. We all want to be not only we all not only want to do the right thing, but we also just want to be better at talent acquisition. And you were a talent acquisition. I'm just excited about how you've seen these worlds come together.
Awesome.
So I want to start by the TA focus case for inclusive hiring. I'd say, DE and I sort of seen an evolution of vocabulary and how we make the case. Maybe 10 years ago, we were starting to talk about this is the right thing to do. This is, we have to fundamentally make our companies represent the people we want to serve, we want to build. And as we started to get more sophisticated, as we're such a young industry in some sense, we started to get more research and data about how companies that had more diversity, that had built these programs in, had more productivity, were performing better. We started to get better at so ESG came up as an idea. We started to get better at making a business case. But I actually think sort of the third iteration of this is a hyper specified, not only a generic business case, but when it comes to talent acquisition specifically, is being able to make the case that inclusive hiring is fundamentally good hiring. And it's not surprising because the things that we do to make our recruiting processes more accessible, more fair, more inclusive. In fact, almost always improve other recruiting metrics. And so it should be. One of the things that's happening in the US is sort of, you know, is with the recent administration's executive orders, there's been sort of this idea of we have to move away from DEI towards merit-based hiring or merit-based approaches. And I think there's almost like a confusion in the vocabulary of what we're trying to do. A few companies have rebranded their approaches to inclusive hiring, maybe calling it belonging, maybe sort of sort of subsuming it in other groups. I thought one really interesting approach was the one that was taken by Delta, where they actually reaffirmed their commitment to inclusive hiring. But what they did was they used the language of the executive order. What they effectively said was, through our commitments to DEI is how we can ensure merit-based hiring and how we can ensure merit-based advancements. And I think that's exactly right. The only way for hiring to be fair and merit-based is if we pay attention to the work that gets done through the lens of DEI. Yumi, I'm kind of curious about your experience with all of this. I'm sure, like us, you're probably doom scrolling as well and aghast at what's happening in the world, but has this permeated across into Europe as well?
Yeah, so uh, where do I even start? So I would say that in my experience, everything that happens in the US, it does come to Europe. I didn't expect it to come so fast. So if I think put my former recruiting hat on, so every if I when I saw like best practices from the US, then I would see like, oh, it's going to come to Finland like 2, 3 years later. But then what was really surprising for me in this case is that everything happening in the D&I space, the conversations that were happening, then it just came like this. It was much faster than I thought. It didn't take years. It took I would say like months. If we go back in time and if we think about how even before the executive orders and we think about the Supreme Court affirmative action cases like that, it was already starting in Finland. So that's why I was really surprised to see like how fast it came. The one thing that I do want to highlight is that yes, in the US, I have started to see some companies that are scaling back or just completely capitulating. But in the case of Europe, or actually EU, is what's different is that there are laws where we have to promote DNI. So if we think about like if I specifically talk about Finland, for instance, then there is, for instance, what's called the Non-Discrimination Act, and the Non-Discrimination Act mandates us to do equality assessments within our workplace. And then based on that, we have to draw up a work community development, diversity, and equality plan. So that's the case for Finland. If we think about Spain, where we have an office, for instance, if you have more than 50 employees, then you have to have LGBT plus inclusion plan, for instance. So if we think about EU, there are laws in different countries that mandate us to promote D&I. And if we bring that to an EU level, then there's, for example, the EU Pay Transparency Directive that's coming our way that will be transposed to national law in June 2026. So it's like the gender gap reporting that the companies need to do. Also, similar to I think certain states in the U.S., the salary information needs to be shared with the candidate before the first interview. So that's happening at the EU level. And then on top of that, there's also what's called the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that's coming our way as well. So if we think about all the laws, EU has no choice not to work on D&I. So that's why what's happening in the US, it does come our way, but again, we don't have the option not to work on it. But then the question is, what is the level that we work on it? There's the minimum that we have
That's
to work on, which is already a lot of work. But on top of that, then each country slash company needs to decide what more are they going to do, because unlike the US, there's nothing that's restricting us. We just have to do so much more.
Do you get the sense that the work that you do is critical to your employer brand and to, especially as new candidates, younger candidates, or sort of entering the workforce, that they're demanding that companies start to be more representative and more
Yeah,
inclusive and more diverse?
Yeah, so on the topic of DNI, I think there's like two angles that we need to think about. What is it that the employees and the candidates, what are they asking for? And then and so that's one discussion of DNI that we have to have, the narrative that we have to manage. And then separately, it's about how do we make sure that we get senior leadership buy-in, because even in my company, there are executives that think, oh, well, this DNI thing is going away in the US, is going away in the US. So do we have to work on this? So when I think
Yeah.
about discussing DNI, there's two. And of course, there are people that are somewhere in the middle, the people who care about this and the people who don't. It's a spectrum. But then for me, like I'm conscious of making sure that I have a message for these two separate audiences, and then not because this is the data people conversations. I think that's where like the data piece becomes so important for both for conversations for both. So when we think about the conversations with some of the skeptics or the leaders who say like, do we really have to work about this? Then I'm we I have enough data to make that case of like why this is not just from a compliance perspective, but why do we need to work on this? And I think some folks know about the loss aversion bias, where people get scared about what they lose as opposed to what they can gain. So then, for me, like my go-to is what is it that we will be losing if we don't work on this? So, for example, productivity. So, if employees are not happy, so from a like an equal opportunity perspective or fair compensation perspective, or for example, representation that or the lack of representation that they see inside the company, then that is loss of productivity for employees, that is attrition. So when we think about that, then I have a strong case for the folks that maybe that are skeptics from the employee side. Then we see that in the from the employee surveys as well, that they care about this. So, for instance, because I'm part of the sustainability team, then we were running a double materiality stakeholder survey, and then we can see that this is a priority for employees as well. So, I feel like I'm in a very fortunate position that I have enough data to make the case and talk about this with different stakeholders.
That's incredible. And I know not everyone is in that position that they have data. So I want to ask the audience a question on the chat. And I'd love to hear your points. But how are you thinking? Are you starting to get pushback about DE&I? I'm sure you've always gotten some degree of pushback about inclusive hiring, about those practices. How do you deal with this? How have you gotten hiring managers, your recruiting teams, to really be empathetic to the candidate experience? And I'd love to hear from you. So please write in and let's share. One of the things that I've found, and one of the things that we're trying to articulate is, what is inclusive hiring? Fundamentally, it's accessibility to all candidates of every background, candidates with, with whatever advantages and disadvantages they may deal with. It's consistent, so we're effective. Like inclusive hiring isn't just solving for our best process, but it's solving for that our median process is always really good, and it's effective. And what it effectively elevates is your employer brand. It elevates your candidate experience. It elevates your TA productivity. Almost every single recruiting, when we've seen this, the investments that companies, when they make investments in inclusive hiring, it's almost always we're seeing TA productivity. In fact, the last time we spoke, we polled the group, and every single recruiting professional on the call said they're struggling with zero capacity. There's no capacity. We're in a unique environment where everyone is sort of capacity constrained. And it's kind of counterintuitive to think that adding inclusion would improve capacity, but it does because it makes you more appealing. You start to get more qualified candidates applying. You start to reduce your drop-offs, improve your offer acceptance rates, and suddenly all of your metrics get better. Yumi, I want to direct you to a great question from on the chat. From Geneva asks, I'm worried about the US administration. The people in my company we had to inspire to care about DEI are going to use this as a reason not to. And I'm sure like one of the biggest worries that we have with what's happening in the US is not that, this necessarily even this onslaught, but it's that it emboldens the part of our society and the part of our organizations that were already reluctant to see change. I'm sure that's the case in Europe too. I'm kind of curious how you deal with that. How do you deal with the hiring managers, the parts of org that are like, we've always done things this way. We have to be, or who view inclusion as like at loggerheads with merit.
Yeah, well, there's so many ways to take this. So, if we're talking about something super tactical, so I give kudos to our head of talent acquisition now. So when like I what you mentioned about the limited capacity, it really resonates because that is a recurring topic that I conversation that I have with her, and something that she repeatedly says is, "What is the minimum that we can do?" Meaning that what is that 1% progress that we can make? We will never be perfect, but what is that 1% progress? And if because that 1% progress compounds, so even though we won't be able to make these bold steps like maybe we were doing in the past, then let's focus on progress and let's focus on minimum. So that's something that her name is Bea. So that's something that she says that really resonates with me. I think another thing that comes to so I would say like definitely that comes to mind. The second piece is what I mentioned earlier about that loss aversion. If I'm being super transparent, one of the main reasons why my position was created because of for risk reasons, meaning that my industry leaders were seeing all like the Me Too movement, like the lawsuits
Yeah.
that were coming out from the US. So
Yeah.
the Ubisofts or the Activision Blizzards, for example, in our industry, that was happening. So again, the fact maybe we were not able to inspire people as we used to do before, but if we're able to talk about if we don't work on this might happen. So then of course our leaders got scared. So they think, oh, we should work on this. We don't want that to happen. So I think I need to tailor the message depending on who I'm talking to and also be super realistic that if capacity is not there, capacity is not there. But then I know that there are people in the company who do care about this, like our head of TA. So then we just focus a lot on the progress over perfection.
I really like your idea of loss aversion, and I think that goes directly to the question at hand. In a moment of time where we can't always inspire, we want to inspire. We want people. We always want our arguments to kind of appeal to people's best angels in their heads. But sometimes we have to kind of focus on the loss aversion. And pay transparency is a great example. If you don't do this, your jobs will suffer. Indeed won't put your jobs, or LinkedIn won't put your jobs. Less candidates will write, bad things on Glassdoor. How do we make
Yeah,
this process more inclusive? And
yeah.
I
And
think
then
that's actually one of the. Oh, I'm so
oh, sorry,
sorry.
go
Please
ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that we talked about that progress. We talked about like the loss, like that loss aversion bias. But then last but not least, it's also that fair piece. Like I don't think anyone can not be against fairness. Exactly what you mentioned about the Delta example, where DNI is essentially about meritocracy. It's I think like that's it's the same with fairness. People can't disagree with fair. So even the people that are like pro meritocracy, then if we talk about these folks with fairness, then there's we're all aligned no matter what when it comes to fairness. So I think those are the things where I'm trying to think about like what are the common denominators across everyone to just to have start that conversation. I wish I could sometimes focus more on the inspiring piece, but if that's the reality and if that's the case, then so be it.
I think there's a third piece, though, which is uh, whether you think of this as the inspiring bucket or the fear loss aversion bucket. We did some analysis, and we found on average more people see a company's jobs than see the company's homepage. Your company's jobs kind of spread all over the world. They go on LinkedIn, they go on Indeed. So people are interacting with your recruit, and that actually extends to all of recruiting. An enormous number of people interact with your brand in the context of recruiting. Like an average large company gets millions of applicants every year, hundreds of thousands of potential customers, potential partners, potential employees are in primary interaction with your organization is through recruiting. And if our recruiting experience is bad, and the number one complaint right now, all over LinkedIn, everywhere, is candidate experience has never been worse. then candidate experience is should be the crux of the way we make the case for DE&I. Employer brand should be the crux of how we make the case for DE&I. Like we forget, in the 80s when there was the case for accessibility in public life, people were all up in arms. The television companies were like, it's too expensive to provide closed captioning for every TV show. And now, let's be honest, we all like rely on closed captioning. We can't live without it. We all benefit from the investments that are get made under the banners of DEI, access A and B. And I think that sometimes we have to remind people of that in our orgs. That we're not just making recruiting better. We're impacting all these people who are touching our brand for the very first time. I'm glad that my closed captioning analogy has resonated. I think we all can't live without it. I mean, those HBO shows are hard to understand. Um, but let's get into some actionable tips because I promised you that, and I wanted to show you some. And these are often great tips I wanted to leave all of you with some tips that you could and some data that you can take your organizations and you can use it to make a case for simple things that make your job, make it fair. Because oftentimes when people think about DEI, they think, oh my God, there's more burden, more process, more this. How do we think about what actually makes your processes both more fair, but also more effective? So tip one, mind the confidence gap. Do folks know what the confidence gap is? I wish we could do a show of hands, but it's hard to do. I'm going to ask of the chat, show of hands, yay or nay. Are folks familiar with the confidence gap? And this is an idea that got really popular when Sheryl Sandberg wrote the book Lean In, where she said, oh, men apply when they see all the job. Men apply when they feel like they only meet 3 out of 5 requirements of a job. And women apply when they only feel like they meet all the requirements of a job. And, this has sort of gone through a number of iterations, but we had the chance to test it with some of our data. And we found the results were just fascinating. One of the things that we found was this actually held true really well. So when companies added a bunch of preferred requirements to the end of the job, the number of the candidate pool size fell. Now, some of you may think that's a good thing in this environment, but the number of women applying fell by 40%. And we also saw fewer underrepresented candidates and, candidates from underrepresented backgrounds applying. But I think what was really fascinating to us was that the number of qualified candidates applying also fell 40%. So not only did preferred requirements not made your jobs, yikes, I'm so sorry, uh, I apologize. My phone is connected to my computer and I get a spam call and everything goes off. I'm going to go back and try to share my screen again. No, that's so embarrassing, but thank you for bearing with me. And I have everything on Do Not Disturb too. So we found this surprising. I was I've been perplexed as to why, and here's my hypothesis as to what's happening. Today, a candidate only gets 8 to 10 seconds to read a job ad. There's so many job ads, and we're in a world where candidates are applying to a lot of jobs and often not hearing back. So they're being really judicious. So if a candidate sees a job, a really qualified candidate, the most thoughtful applicants are really paying attention to like risk reward. Do I have a really good shot of getting this job? If you write a job that has, I want an MBA, I want a PhD, I want this, I want that, they're asking either this company doesn't know what it wants, or I they're going to find candidates like that, and I have no chances, even if I meet all of the major requirements, and they choose not to apply, and effectively your candidate pool suffers. In fact, what happens is we're seeing as jobs get longer and longer, we're seeing more and more one-click applies, unqualified candidates who just don't read the job, but they just, you know, and it just makes the lives of talent acquisition miserable. I'm kind of curious. There's other ways the confidence gap manifests in the recruiting process. How do you think about this? Has this showed up in your hiring and in the way you sort of think about hiring at Rovio and before?
So I'm going to be completely honest. I have to give a shout out to you. So, Amit and I, the two of us, have been on connected on LinkedIn for some time, and I still remember the comment that you posted about, "Hey, Yumi, have you thought about the length of the job ad and what that means?" So I have to give you a shout out to that because
Oh,
because
thank
of,
you.
of that comment that you posted on my LinkedIn post. That's I went back to our TA team and shared that. So I want to give you a shout out to that
I've
because of your LinkedIn comment made a difference to how we approach recruiting at OVO.
Well, I feel like there's such a small community that is like out there sharing tactical tips. So I've learned so much from you over the years, and I'm so glad that I was able to give back. And I think many of the folks on today's chat are folks that I've followed, I've learned from. Hopefully, one day we'll have you on one of these workshops as well, and convince you to join me. But one of the things I love about being part of the TA community is there's such a willingness to share ideas and interact.
Yeah. Can I ask one question for you?
Of course.
So, one related question to this, I've seen some companies, they specifically add some verbiage of how, hey, we know that this is what the data says, that like there are gender differences, and then they say, even if you don't feel like you meet all the requirements, please apply. And I'm wondering, what is your take on that?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't
Um,
matter.
it's
Okay.
it doesn't matter. And I'll be honest, I honestly think that like let's say I wrote a resume that was 17 pages, and at the end of it, I put a line in there that said, even if I'm not the perfect fit for this job, I have the tenacity. Like, would you pay attention to that? No. Um, the average candidate is spending 8, 10 seconds on LinkedIn looking at your job. They're not parsing those. Like we assume, I think we in talent acquisition sometimes assume that the candidates are like scrubbing every job word of your job description. They're not. I think it's more important to have short, concise jobs with just the specific critical requirements you need to have, as much clarity, and the extra fluff doesn't matter.
Love it. Thank you.
That's a great question. And I think someone asked the question on the chat, like, what's the takeaway? Be mindful of the length of the JDs and the number of requirements. So I think every word above 400 to 500 words in a job description comes with a penalty. In attention, in quality, you start to see more unqualified applicants, and that's just clogging up all of our path. Every additional qualification starts to read like a laundry list. So the more you can be really mindful, sometimes you have to also be clear. Sometimes I see hiring managers will write a JD and they'll put two, maybe one critical requirement, and then everything else will be fluff. They'll just be like, oh, you have great communication skills. But like, yeah, what do you want? Because then they're going into the interview and they clearly have someone in mind. They clearly have like, I want this type of experience. But why our goal should be to give candidates as much clarity as we can so they can opt in and opt out and help us create a better process for everybody. Related to the confidence gap is the idea of title inflation. One thing I really get worried about when I see jobs these days is it feels like we're inflating titles over and over again. Used to be like, now, like I see entry level jobs sometimes called senior scientist, senior engineer. And you're like, hang on a second. How does this work? And I think the theory has been if we call it more senior, maybe more qualified candidates will apply. Well, is that the case? What we've found is there's two wrinkles to that. One is the title is the primary thing that people use in search. So the titles really drive your visibility of the job. And if you title it too senior, it doesn't even show up on the right searches. And that can be a problem for you. The other thing is, again, like the confidence gap, people are nervous that they don't just want to apply for a job that they really want. They want to apply for a job that they think they will get. Because applying for a job is a soul-sucking experience, especially on certain applicant tracking systems. And so they don't want to go through that effort. So we've got to make sure that we title it appropriately. What we've found is it's okay to call a senior a soft senior starts to become useful when a job needs 4 or 5 years of experience, but when it's only 2 years of experience, and we've seen this in software engineering, we've seen this in data science, we've seen this in FP&A roles, in finance and G&A roles, it's really important. And what we found was just like the confidence gap, when you over title a job, not only do you get fewer women and fewer candidates from underrepresented backgrounds, you actually get fewer qualified candidates. In fact, if there's one tip I could leave you all, is really think about clarity in your titles. If this, it will immediately improve the quality of your candidate pools right away, and everything starts to work better. How does this is also a constant fight with hiring managers, and I'm curious that like when you've in your past life in recruiting, how did you sort of navigate titling with the hiring managers?
I wish I had known this when I was doing recruiting. So if I look, so when I was still doing hands-on recruiting, I would say like that was 3-ish years ago. I didn't know this, and how I was approaching it was exactly as you mentioned. I think I remember sitting down with hiring managers where it's like, oh, okay, we're not entirely sure what kind of candidates would come in. So I clearly remember when there were, I would put like senior in parentheses. But then to your point, it's if I had known this, I would have done it differently.
Yeah, I agree. It's and sometimes the data can be just so counterintuitive. Um, have any, I'm kind of curious in the chat while we go through the other, I'd love to hear from you if you've had issues with your organizations about titling. Titling becomes a big issue because sometimes compensation gets really embedded to it. They want to use the same document internally and externally, but the internal job description is it's a legal document. The external job description is an ad, and we have to understand that they're very different. My third tip is a very simple one. Balance referrals. Referrals are sometimes your most valuable source of candidates. They can be incredible, but there's an in-group factor. Over the last 4 or 5 years, one of the things that I've been really worried about is companies started to rely more and more on referrals. You started to see referral platforms, you started to see referral bonuses, and that becomes a real problem. It becomes a problem on so many levels. One is it's a TA problem because TA feels obligated to have to, if some senior hiring manager makes a referral, you're like, oh my God, I got to manage the relationship. I have to talk to this candidate. Who's got time for that? But there's a bigger issue, even if your referrals are driving great candidate pools, which is the in-group factor. When we looked at the data, we found men are twice as likely to refer other men. Women don't show such a bias, surprisingly. And similarly with sort of historically underrepresented candidates are that can be actually a really great source of further diversifying, building into networks of communities that you may not have as much reach and access to. But one of the problems with companies' approach diversification is, oh, you maybe you're an old manufacturing org that's 80% male, you're trying to bring more women into the org, you're trying to bring people of different backgrounds into the org. Well, if you're relying on referrals as your core crutch, then you're more likely to continue to build a candidate pipeline that looks a lot like your current employee base, and then becomes harder to diversify. So referrals is one of those things that just it's okay if it's 5% of your hiring. It's okay if there's a piece, but you got to be really diligent about not making that a fundamental crutch. Tip 4. And I want to get to sort of just these last couple of tips, and then I really want to sort of get into some Q&A. One of the things that we really discovered in the last few sessions is we've never been in a world where location is more confusing. Hybrid means 50 different things. You mean, if I'm not mistaken, Rovio is hybrid today? Now, what does hybrid mean at Rovio?
So hybrid is we have it doesn't apply to everyone, but for most of our employees, it means 2 days in the office and the remaining 3 days from home.
Oh, that's amazing. That would almost be remote here in the US. I feel like
Really?
now hybrid is like, oh, you get a day off. And that's one of the problems. Hybrid is the definition of what is hybrid has massively evolved. Um, and the way the candidate pools behave are hugely different. Like remote jobs are getting hundreds of applications. Hybrid jobs are getting quite a few applications, and on-site jobs are fewer. And sometimes we are like, a job gets picked up as remote and gets way too many applicants, and we don't know what to deal with it. One of the things that we're starting to see on our end is when companies are not clear about location, we're starting to see a pickup in the drop-off rates of candidates. So candidates get to the interview stage and they're like, whoa, 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 I didn't sign up. Like, this is not the job that was advertised. And they drop off. Or sometimes it's as bad as they get to the offer stage and they drop off because they think that there's a chance this will be remote and it's not. And that drop off disproportionately seems to impact people from underrepresented backgrounds. And it's no surprise because in our society, for better or worse, women in underrepresented uh, populations tend to have a disproportionate amount of the caregiving responsibilities. And so being specific about location, about flexibility becomes critical to their ability to decide on a job. And so if we want to be inclusive, even a single sentence that says, hey, in our jobs, that says, look, this is a hybrid job. We expect you to be 2 days a week in the office, but you have 3 days. But being very, very clear about that is critical because the search engines aren't always very good at classifying whether this job is remote or hybrid or on-site, and it creates a mountain of confusion. And Aaron, exactly. There's a lot of jobs being calling themselves hybrid, and then they're effectively 4.5 days in the office. That's not hybrid. And we've got to be really clear. So I actually love your approach to hybrid and remote. I'm sure even then, like it results in some confusion though, because people aren't always used to what hybrid means.
Yeah, so Finland was one of the most earliest to earliest to adopt remote work in when COVID hit. So that's why as a country, remote work is very much appreciated. But then you gave me an idea that I thought that working 2 days in the office is, I didn't think it's a big deal, but just seeing your response that some companies would call hybrid 4 days in the office, then that's a surprise for me.
Do you feel like, and Brett brings a really good question in the chat, do you feel like European expectations of remote work are different than the US?
Wait, what are the expectations in the US? To be more than 3 or 4 days in the
So
office?
I think a remote job in the US is genuinely remote, right? You can work from anywhere. And hybrid is today, I think the median hybrid job is 3 days in the office, 2 days from home.
Wow.
Um, so it's so there's a variation. I'm kind of curious, like when you think hybrid in Europe, what does hybrid mean to you? Like, do you think it's 2 days, at most 2 days in the office?
I think it really depends on the company, but even
Yeah.
if I think just within our company, coming back to the office 2 days a week was quite a significant change, and there was a lot of change management that had to happen. But yeah,
Yeah.
I've just learned that some companies would call 4 days in the office hybrid. So
Yeah.
that's a surprise. Wow.
Roy asks a really good question. Says, do you recommend highlighting the required number of days in the office on the posting? And I absolutely do. It's a really good question. Just it's super helpful to be as clear as you can on location. Sometimes there's companies that have like it's a work from home opportunity, but you need to be in, I don't know, 50 miles of the office, so 30 miles of the office because we may need to go in from time to time. Be very specific. Don't call that job remote because it's not. It's at best hybrid. And so it just really helps clarity. The more clarity you can add on location, don't obviously don't add a 17 paragraph boilerplate on it. But if you could add specificity, it's the thing that will actually really improve your drop-off rates, your offer acceptance rates. It just smoothens out your whole process, especially in the specific time we're in. Carol
Wow.
brings up a good point as well. So we have 200 employees, she says. Hybrid varies. The larger groups are work 2 days in the office, and then the other folks are in 5 days a week. And that becomes really important because then you want to separate it out. Sometimes I've noticed a few companies, they kind of put hybrid or remote as like a perk or a benefit. And so they kind of water it down and they put it on all their jobs. That's fine. But if you're in a situation where some jobs are very different from the others, rather than put that in the perks and benefits section, put it up front on the very top where you're like, this is my specific location requirements for this role. So I'm going to bring you to tip number 5. Creating accommodations for neurodivergent candidates. In fact, this is the topic that I was, really, really interested in talking to you about, Yumi, because there's a small group of DE&I professionals that have been really thinking about how do we not only make our processes inclusive and accessible for people of all sorts of backgrounds, but also specifically thinking about neurodivergence and thinking about making accommodations for them. And I remember, a few years ago, you decided to put accommodation statements in your job descriptions for neurodivergence for all your job descriptions, not just the ones that had physical requirements. How did you arrive at thinking about neurodivergence as something that needed to be come under the banner of accessibility at Rovio?
So definitely from the employees. So I started this DNI position 2.5 years ago, and then the first I would say like 3 months was to figure out what is it that I need to do. It was the first DNI position that we had in house, intern or ever. And then from there, then employees started reaching out to me, like what is it that we're going to do for neurodiversity? So of course the gender, of course the LGBTQA plus. Or like race and ethnicity, like those are like very straightforward from a DNI perspective, but neurodiversity was the one where people proactively reached out to me and say, hey, what are we going to do about this? And then from there, what we did is again data. So I did this DNI. I didn't call it DNI survey, but basically it was a DNI survey. And then the first survey, we had there were 7% employees who said that they were neurodivergent in this survey. And then if we think about the general population, it's estimated that 15 to 20% of the world's population is neurodivergent. So that's why it was 7 for us, even though the estimates were 15 to 20. So my
Yeah.
hypothesis there was that we were lacking psychological safety. Fast forward a year and a half later, when we did our second DNI survey, it shot up to 20%. So it's
Wow.
yeah, from seven, just a year and a half later, it went from 7% to
That's such
20%.
a huge accomplishment that you were able
Yeah,
to create an environment where people felt comfortable participating in that survey and that at that rate.
yeah. Like I would say, not to say that we have fixed everything, but then just if I go back to like accommodation for in terms of neurodiversity, just again, I go back to that progress over perfection. We have put a lot of focus on like what are these micro interventions that we can put into place, and then just those like micro actions compounding, and then it was a huge moment of celebration. And again, if I think about the work from the office 2 days policy that we have in place from a neurodiversity perspective, those are things that become challenging. So again, it's not perfect, but just seeing that alignment with the estimates of the general population, that was a huge milestone for us.
But it's also and Catherine brings this point up, right? It's such a great testament to how a DEI initiative has such direct business value. Because, if you're suppressing at the workplace, the fact that you're not neurodivergent, you're sort of working around it without like by yourself, you're guaranteed to be less productive and less effective. And so often, and we end up sort of without truly understanding our population and sort of some of their constraints and limitations, we end up sort of getting into performance reviews or getting into frustrations or sort of why. And hiring is the most expensive decision many of us make in our companies. So the fact that you're able to kind of create an environment where people feel psychologically safe, feel comfortable, you're able to even poll your audience and kind of bring that up and then create accommodations has to translate to such tangible business value that's phenomenal. But I wanted to sort of touch on when you were thinking about this exact point. What are the kinds of accommodations that you put in place to really help both in the recruiting process and then also beyond the recruiting process?
So the most interesting thing ever in terms of neuro inclusion is that just focusing on very, very basic um, like recruiting best practices is also neuro inclusive. So if we think about structured hiring, structured interviews, like all of that. So making sure about what you're recruiting for, what is the what does the hiring process look like, who are the interviewers, which interviewer is going to be assessing what, what are the rubrics that we're going to be using to assess the candidate. All of those like very basic things that we have learned as TA professionals, that directly ties into neuro inclusion. So for the folks who are feeling that, oh, I'm not doing anything yet, rest assured, you are most likely doing something already if you have already done implemented structured hiring, which I believe like many of us have are
Yeah.
are doing, hopefully. So I would say like that's like the starting point.
But
Uh,
could you, Yumi, I'm going to sorry to interrupt you, but maybe for some of the folks who may not be as familiar, could you sort of give your two-sentence definition of structured hiring?
yeah, so how would I do it? It's basically being very structured about what you're hiring for and how you're going to hire for it. And then once you have that structures in place, making sure that it's clearly communicated to the candidate, period. So then for especially for candidates who are neurodivergent, being very clear about how they're going to be assessed, who are they going to meet, how long is the interview? Is it going to be in person? Like what happens when they arrive? If it's an in person, what happens when they arrive to the office? Like all of that, like very clear way of hiring. Those are just neuro inclusive as well. So just if you, I don't think you necessarily have to just go like, how do I approach how do I approach neuro inclusive hiring? Of course, there are books you can read about it, but then if you just go to I'm assuming that Data People site already also has some resources of like this is how
They
you
do.
approach recruiting. Like, so I would say like definitely go back to like the basics and start focusing on that.
You know what I love about that is one of the number one complaints that talent acquisition professionals have is the hiring managers change the process up on them, right? Like last minute, oh, I want to put in another case study interview. I want to bring in, and it's so hard to get our organization sometimes to be structured about the way they hire. And in effect, because you're creating transparency for the candidate, you're kind of like binding your own org into a commitment as to this is what our process is going to be like. And we're going to follow it consistently for every candidate. And we're not going to, make it a two-stage process for one candidate and a seven-stage. So the commitment to neurodivergence, neuro-inclusion leads to a commitment to fairness, leads to a commitment to candidate experience, and eventually will lead to a better employer brand. So it's that's fantastic. I feel like every company should do that. One of the things that we've been seeing some of our best users do is in the platform, they will create as part of the intake meeting, they'll write the great job description, but they'll also create an email template of that describes the process. So as soon as a candidate has been invited to interview, they'll get this email that says exactly what you outlined, who they'll meet at different stages of the process, what to expect, how what to expect between it. A lot of recruiters today complain, oh my God, candidates are constantly hounding me about how I'm following up, checking in on the process. Why have I not heard? And this is one of the best ways to kind of also free up your capacity. You tell them, I probably will take 2 weeks between this stage, and I won't be responsive to you at that time. And that's okay. And that they're very respectful of that when you create that transparency. So I love it.
Yeah, very straightforward. And if I may, if I just quickly share things that are like very specific to like neuro
Yes,
inclusion that
please.
we focused on. So we don't have all our interviews in person, but for the interviews that we do in person in all of our meeting rooms, we have fidget toys now. Of course, these are usable for our employees as well, but they're also open to our interviewers. And it's the most kind of like the silliest thing ever. And maybe it only works because we're a games company and like people are there to create entertainment. It's like joy. But then it's also like such a great starting point to the conversation where people walk into the meeting room and there's these like very bright fidget toys sitting there and thinking like, what is this for? Oh, because we know that for neurodivergent candidates that it actually helps them pay attention if there's something that they can hold on to or like fidget with. So that's why it actually it's like a real, not only is it good for the employees, it's not only good for the interviewers, but it's also like an educational tool as well because it's so bright. And usually like the fidget toys are like very colorful. So that's why it's been a really great way to raise awareness too.
That is, I would not have thought of that. That is so cool. Now,
So silly. It's so silly.
to be fair, I do get nervous of like someone spinning the fidget toy the whole interview.
If it's like the spinning things, yes,
That
but
would
then there's
drive me bananas.
yeah, but there rest assured there's so many fidget toys out there these days. So there's like tons of different variations. So and of course there's some like fidget toys that make a lot of sounds as well, but then
Yeah.
that's also something that I think about, like how do we make sure that the fidget toys don't become distracting for other people?
We've gone through our own experiments with this. One of the things that we decided to do was with every job that we hire for, we typically do a project. And we, for a long time, early on, we used to debate like, do we do like for engineering, do you do like a coding project that's live so we can collaborate, or do you do it offline? And I realized that like the live part was so contrived and stressful for a lot of people that we kind of had to do like we want to have like a collaboration segment, but we really wanted people to be able to do it offline. And that makes it harder. In a chat GPT world, you're like a little bit more nervous about doing that, but it's one of those things that you if you don't do it, you just the amount of stress you create, it ends up being very uninclusive from a neuro perspective. And then the other sort of then thing we realized was in order if you wanted to make our processes more inclusive, if you had them do a project, you then needed them to prioritize the project because every job had 17 projects that people wanted them to do. So we started to pay people for projects, not a huge amount of money, a few $100s, but it immediately meant that people took our projects more seriously. It also meant that people from disproportionately sort of historically underrepresented backgrounds who maybe were doing part-time jobs or doing freelancing, they would think of, they wouldn't sort of, the opportunity cost of their time would be valued in some way.
I love it.
But it's tricky. It's tricky to figure this out. I love these ideas. I'm kind of curious. I'm going to ask the audience. Are there other tips that you've done, not only from a neuro perspective, but across the board, simple things that you would share to make processes more inclusive? And even if it feels obvious to you, share it because you'll be surprised. Sometimes, our field is so young, but sometimes what's obvious to somebody is actually quite new and fresh to somebody else. So I'd love to hear ideas in the chat. What else let's go beyond the interview for a minute. How did you make the rest of the work environment
Uh,
inclusive for neuro inclusive?
So I would say that comes first. So making sure the inclusion is there, and well, although it happens in tandem, but I want to over-index on the inclusion piece because if we bring the great talent in and they're gone, then what's the point? So from like a journey perspective, how we started it was we had a neurodiversity awareness webinar that was open to all employees, and followed by smaller like workshops for our the people managers, our HR team, colleagues, and also like we have these position called game lead. So then start with just the overall awareness from their more targeted content that focuses on like performance management, creating psychological safety, how this applies from a recruiting perspective for workshops. And then from there, then it's as I keep going back to these like this the progress over perfection, but just like it's again like small little adjustments. So for example, the workplace that we have, how do we make sure that there are we call them the silent working areas. So then employees can go to if they're like sensitive to sounds, they can work there. So like all these from a workplace perspective, from a neuro inclusive meeting perspective. So all these like little things started. And then from there, we also then we started sharing externally what we were doing, and that goes back to the employer branding piece that that you were talking about earlier. So as we start doing inclusion internally, then after a couple months, then we started talking about that externally too. So we've done two conferences so far, where in terms of how we've been approaching neuro inclusion at Rovio.
That's fantastic. That I realize that I just looked at the time and I'm like, wow, that went fast. And I realized that I promised and I'd offered a networking session, but I don't think we have time left to do that. But I'm so grateful for everyone on the chat who's given such phenomenal ideas, thoughts, questions, and comments. So I have one offer for all of you on the chat, which is one of the things that we're doing is sort of a very quick inclusion audit of your JDs. If that's helpful, we can sort of run that for you and just give you 3 or 4 easy tips that you can operationalize right away to make your hiring processes more fair. So if you're interested, I'm going to share my email in the chat. Just email me. I can also follow up with any answers to questions you have. If you've got questions for Yumi, I can direct them to her and get you answers as well. And we will share the stats and the deck and this recording with all of the participants. Thank you for such an incredible conversation, Yumi. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much. And I'm also on LinkedIn, so if anyone wants to connect, yeah, but you'll find me there.
As am I. Let's build a small community of making hiring fundamentally more fair for everybody. So I'm putting my email in the chat if folks want their us to analyze their roles for quick tips. But Yumi, this has been one of the most insightful conversations I've had. Thank you. It's so great to hear from a practitioner, and the work you've done on neuro inclusion. It's inspiring. So thank you for sharing that with the audience.
Thank you.
And everyone, thank you for your phenomenal participation. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and a wonderful week. We'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.